Hello everybody and welcome to Long Range Science. Today we'll be looking at mounting a scope to my precision competition rifle. This is a Christensen Arms MPR competition model with a heavy steel barrel in 6mm GT. The scope I'm going to be mounting today is an Apex Optics Rival 4-32 by 56. And I will be mounting it with the worn Skyline Precision one-piece scope rings. Now apart from the hardware, we are going to need a few tools. So here I have some levels, and we also have a torque wrench. This is from Real Avid with the appropriate bits. And as you can see, I've also got my rifle mounted in the Real Avid master vise to make sure that everything is locked and solid so you don't bump anything through the installation process. Now before we start mounting anything, I want to make sure that my action is level so I can index the optic with the bore and align the reticle correctly. Just so to start, I have one piece of the Wheeler scope leveling kit, and now this one has a magnetic base, and it is designed to fit inside the action of a Remington 700 receiver to bolt down to the raceways to make sure that the raceways are going to be level. The level is now placed, and we are slightly out of alignment, so I'm going to use the adjustment knob on the Real Avid vise to bring the level into alignment. Now this is going to be one of the key parts, because what we're trying to do when we mount our scope is we want our reticle to be true to the bore, meaning that the vertical stadia of the reticle is going to pass right through the line of the bore. And what that's going to do is that's going to prevent us from getting any error from cant when we start reaching out to longer distances. That's a topic for another video, but for right now, just remember that it is important that that reticle is lined up with the bore, so it's important that everything is going to be true, which we will look at here a little bit later, and actually truing the reticle to the bore. Now we are going to put on the scope rings. So if you've set up a rifle before, one thing that's going to be very important is to put marks on all of your equipment on where it is supposed to be located. If you're setting up a new one, it's going to be just a little bit of trial, fit, and error. But if you have one that you've set before and you're taking off, always put indexing marks and locating marks on the optic, the rings, and the rail so that you can put everything back in relatively the same position if you have to take apart or disassemble anything. We've got the mount placed on the rails. I'm going to turn my torque wrench to 40 inch-pounds for these side lock screws. Some of them will be a nut, some of them will be a hex wrench. It just depends on the type you get. But I'm going to do these in an alternating fashion so that I don't bind anything up on the mounting process. I want everything to be aligned correctly with the rail, with the receiver, and get as much contact as possible so it don't get any movement or issues from recoil. So I'm going to hand tight first. Come and do the final full torque. Right. And the ring is now locked into place. Now it's time to place the scope. So again, this is where your index marks come in. For this particular rifle, I have set it up before. I want my rings aligned with these index marks here in the back. This is going to ensure that I have proper eye relief when I'm behind the rifle. Eye relief is just going to be something you're going to have to try again. If you haven't set it up before, the eye relief is just going to be how far away the scope is from your face when you're mounted on a rifle. You get it in your scope rig set up, and you're just going to slide it back and forth until you find a good field of view, or you're getting rid of the blackness around the edges, and you've got a full view picture in the optic. Also keep in mind that the scope rings are supposed to have a small gap on either side of the ring. This is to ensure that they get a full clamping force, that it doesn't bottom out on the bottom rings before it gets full contact with the scope. So one way I'm going to ensure that, make sure I've got the gap appropriately, is I'm going to put a piece of paper or some cardstock, something a little bit thicker, over on one side, and lightly tighten it down until I feel it bottom out on the paper. So I can move the paper so I know I've got a slight gap on that side. And I'm going to do the same thing again here, kind of hand tight these until they come into position. Now let's check, and I can still rotate the scope. I can slide it back and forth, but you can see it definitely has some resistance to it. Now the traditional way to level and make sure the reticle is true is just going to be to take a level, set it on top of your scope turret, and rotate the optic until that bubble is in the correct position. Now, this works very well. However, you may get some error depending on the scope. A lot of your high-end scopes tend to be a little bit more trued, but some optics, the reticle itself is not going to be trued to the body of the scope or to the turret. So this can give you a little bit of error. So this is going to get us a good start, but here we'll do a trick here in a second to ensure that the reticle is actually true and plumb with the bore. Now it is time to actually check the reticle itself and make sure that it is true. To do this, we are going to get a white piece of paper and use that as a backing. We're going to get a string with a weight on the end and a little nail to hang it from. So we're going to make ourselves a small plumb line about a foot behind the rifle. Now the reason for this is we're going to use something called the flashlight trick. And what happens is if you take a flashlight, you can shine it through the objective lens on the scope, and what you will do is you will project an inverted image of your reticle onto the back wall. So I'm going to turn this up to the brightest setting. We'll place it on here. It's going to be a little bit tougher. This is easier to do in the nighttime, but we can still see it. We should be able to kind of get still a good idea off of this. Now what this is going to allow us to do is actually see the reticle, make sure that it is true with a plumb line, and since we know our receiver is level, we know that the vertical crosshair, the vertical stadia of the reticle, is going to be in line with our bore. Now I have mounted this scope before and I have verified it against a plumb line, but just so you can see the reticle move, we can rotate it back and forth slightly until that is going to be true with our plumb line. Let's kind of move it over so it's centered. A little too far. And back. And again, if you do it when it's a little bit darker, it will show up a little bit better, but we could still get an idea of where it is and still use that to set the optic. Now that we have it set, it's aligned with the mark, so I know the reticle is true. I know that my eye relief is going to be good. The mounting position is going to be the same. Now it's just time to tighten down the scope rings. Now this is something you're always going to want to use a torque wrench for. Because there is that gap between the scope rings, you can over torque them and crush the scope tube. And that's going to lead to issues in your parallax, your optics, and even your adjustability. One telltale sign is if you go to use your magnification and it's very stiff or sticky, that probably means you've over torqued your rings, you're crushing the tube, and the magnification is not able to adjust correctly. So I'm going to set these to 18 inch-pounds. It's usually between 15 and 20. Definitely refer to the scope and scope ring manufacturer. Now I have these started, so they work a little snug. So I'm going to come and just kind of do them in iterations in a cross pattern again to prevent binding and spread the force out evenly. We'll go ahead and torque them to a click. And now it's mounted. The rear one's going to be enough to keep the scope into place. Now I can just mount the front one. And there we have it. Scope is now mounted, trued, and ready to go and ready to get to zero. Now the last thing I'm going to do on this one is set up my MDT LRA send it level. If you have a bubble level, then you can do the same thing, but now that I've got everything mounted and trued, I'm just going to set my level up here on my forward mounting platform. This is the one I'm going to be using in competition. The lights are easier to see out of my peripheral and check and make sure I'm level before I break the shot without having to come out of my shooting position. Again, we'll go over the effects of cant at distance in a different video, but we will just get everything set up here to start with. So I now have the level on. Green in the middle is showing level. If we come and rotate it to the left, it shows red to turn that way. Now it's blue to come back to the left. And I'm going to come back and set my other bubble level on the receiver and verify that the level is trued as well. And there we have it. The scope is now mounted, trued, ready to go get a zero, and we can start stretching it out to long range. Thanks, everybody.